I still remember the way the August heat clung to my shirt as I carried the last box up 9 flights of stairs. The elevator was out of order, of course it was, so each trip felt like some initiation ritual the university had designed to test whether you were really meant to be here. When I finally reached the hallway of the freshman dorm, the air smelled faintly of carpet cleaner, microwaved noodles, and nerves. Doors were propped open, parents hovered with advice, and music from 3 different decades competed for dominance. Room 912. That was going to be home for the next year. I stood outside it for a moment, catching my breath, listening to the muffled voices inside. A few deep breaths later, I turned the handle and stepped in. The room was smaller than I'd pictured, barely 20 feet long, 10 feet wide. 2 mirror image halves divided by a narrow path down the center. On each side stood a bed, a desk, and a set of shelves pretending to be a closet. The beds were mounted on sliding frames so they could double as couches, and at the far wall, a thin strip of window looked out over the campus lawn. A guy was already there, kneeling beside one of the desks, untangling a mess of computer cables. He looked up when I came in, a pair of dark eyes meeting mine through slightly smudged glasses. "You must be my roommate," he said. His tone was flat but not unfriendly. "I'm James." "Hey," I replied, shifting the box in my arms. Yeah, I'm your new roommate." He stood, wiping his hands on his shorts. He was shorter than me by quite a bit, maybe 5'6", lean but not fragile. His t-shirt was a faded band tee that had definitely seen better days. I offered my hand, and he looked at it for half a second as if calculating whether it was worth the effort, then shook it. "Left side's yours," he said, nodding toward the unclaimed bed. "I already tested the outlets. That one's better for a fridge." "Good to know," I said, trying to sound casual even though my mind was already spinning with first-day anxiety. How to act normal, whether he'd notice my hands trembling, whether I should have worn something cooler than the plain polo my mom insisted looked responsible. We worked in silence for a while, me unpacking clothes and books, him assembling what looked like a small computer lab on his desk. Every so often he hummed tunelessly under his breath, or muttered at a stubborn cable tie. The sound filled the tiny room like static. When I reached for my poster tube, he glanced over. "You like movies?" "Yeah, mostly old ones. Hitchcock, that kind of stuff." He nodded approvingly. "Good taste. I'm more of a science documentary guy, but I respect suspense." That was the first glimpse of how his brain worked, scientific, precise, yet oddly poetic. As we talked, I learned he was a sophomore on a pre-med fast track. He spoke about classes he never attended but somehow aced, about professors he called by first names, about research projects he found boring but necessary. I listened, half impressed, half bewildered. He seemed too confident for 19. I'd barely figured out where the dining hall was, and here he was joking about organic chemistry like it was Sudoku. After an hour, the RA came by to drop off the roommate questionnaire. It was a printed sheet meant to avoid conflicts. Questions about bedtimes, study habits, visitors, lights on or off. We sat cross-legged on our opposite beds, filling it out together. "What time do you usually go to sleep?" I asked. "Whenever my brain stops," he said. "You?" "Midnight, I guess." "Cool. Noise tolerance?" "I like quiet." He smirked. "Then you're lucky I'm not in a band." We went through questions about cleaning duties, food sharing, and personal space. He answered honestly, maybe too honestly. "I should mention," he said, pen tapping the paper, "I'm not big on wearing clothes when I'm in my room." I blinked, unsure if he was joking. "Like pajamas?" "Like minimal clothing," he clarified. "Shorts, maybe less. It's not a weird thing. I just get hot easily." "Oh, okay," I said quickly, pretending it didn't faze me. "It's your room too." He gave a satisfied nod and scribbled something on the page. "See? This questionnaire works." The conversation moved on, but my mind stayed snagged on that comment. I told myself it didn't matter. People had different comfort levels, but the image lingered anyway, vivid and distracting. When my parents called to check in that evening, I stood in the hallway pretending everything was normal. "Yeah, he's nice," I said, eyeing the closed door behind me. Really smart. Keeps to himself. Back inside, James had transformed the room. His desk was already glowing with 2 monitors, textbooks stacked like miniature skyscrapers. My side still looked like a thrift store explosion. He caught me staring. You'll figure out your setup. Everyone does. I'm not very good at making things look cool, I admitted. Good news, he said, typing rapidly. College isn't a decorating contest. He had a way of saying things that sounded blunt but somehow comforting. Over the next hour, we swapped small talk about hometowns. I told him I grew up in a small suburb outside Dallas. He said he was from Houston, second-generation Vietnamese, and had a mother who called twice a day to ask if he'd eaten. I usually just tell her yes, he said with a shrug. Even if I haven't. I laughed. That's probably safer. He grinned then, a quick flash of warmth that softened his whole face. It was the first time I saw the charm hidden behind his dry demeanor. By midnight, the hallway had quieted down to the low hum of air conditioning and distant laughter. We both lay in our beds, 2 or 3 feet apart, separated by nothing but the narrow strip of carpet. So, he said into the dark, you nervous about tomorrow? Terrified. He chuckled. Good. Means you care. For a moment I thought that was the end of it. Then he added, you'll be fine. People like you. It was such a simple statement, but it struck deeper than he probably realized. I'd spent most of high school feeling invisible. Hearing it from a near stranger, in that quiet room where the city lights flickered through the blinds, felt oddly grounding. Thanks, I murmured. A pause. Then, half asleep, he said, by the way, I wasn't kidding about being comfortable here. I'm allergic to shirts after midnight. I rolled my eyes in the dark, thankful he couldn't see the faint smile creeping across my face. Noted. There was a rustle of fabric, a sigh, and then silence. I lay there staring at the ceiling, heart thudding faster than it should have, thinking about how strange and unpredictable this new chapter already felt. The room was still, except for the sound of our twin fans and his steady breathing. Outside, somewhere down the hall, someone laughed and a door slammed. But here, in this tiny dorm that smelled faintly of cardboard boxes and new beginnings, everything felt suspended, uncertain, and oddly hopeful. That was my first night of college. Too hot, too bright, and already full of complications I didn't yet understand. By the second week of classes, the chaos had settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with the blare of someone's alarm 2 doors down, the hiss of showers down the hall, and the dull thud of textbooks dropped onto desks. I'd stumble out of bed half awake, trying not to trip over the power cords snaking across our narrow floor. College life was louder, faster, and messier than I'd imagined. The dining hall always smelled faintly of burnt toast, and every lecture seemed to start earlier than any human brain should be awake. But in the middle of all that confusion, one thing became oddly reliable: James. Living with him was like sharing space with controlled chaos. He was both brilliant and careless, the kind of person who could ace a test he forgot existed, but also lose his keys twice in one morning. He never set an alarm. Somehow, his internal clock just knew when to wake up. When he did, it was always abrupt. He'd sit up, blink once like he was booting up, then grab whatever clothes were closest. Usually that meant not much at all. First, it made me uneasy. His comfort with his body was so different from my own. I'd been raised to think modesty was good manners. He treated modesty like an optional elective. The first few times he walked around shirtless while scrolling through his phone, I froze, unsure whether to look away or act normal. But after a while, normality just happened. I learned to focus on my cereal or the TV or the half-written essay on my laptop. And yet, something about his ease fascinated me. He never seemed self-conscious. There was no performance in his confidence. It just existed, quiet and effortless. Classes were manageable once I got past the first wave of panic. I made a few acquaintances, ate lunch with people from my English seminar, and joined the film club mostly because it gave me an excuse to stay out late without feeling guilty. But every evening, no matter how the day went, I always found myself looking forward to returning to room 912. That room, small, perpetually messy, faintly smelling of detergent and instant noodles, became our bubble. James and I fell into our own pattern. He'd sprawl across his bed surrounded by open textbooks and half-finished energy drinks while I worked quietly at my desk. Sometimes we'd talk about professors, assignments, or how bad the cafeteria chicken tasted that day. Other times, conversation wandered. One night, we argued over movies. I'd put on The Prestige because I wanted background noise while I studied. 10 minutes in, James paused his own work and said, "Wait, is this the Magician movie with Christian Bale or the other Magician movie with Edward Norton?" "The Prestige," I said. "Bale. And Hugh Jackman." He squinted at the screen. "So the other one is The Illusionist, right? That came out the same year." Humanity really said, "You know what we need? 2 magician dramas." I laughed, which earned a pleased smirk from him. "You're impossible," I said. "Statistically improbable," he corrected. "Not impossible." That was James. Half the time he didn't mean to be funny. He just said things the way he thought them, blunt and literal, and somehow it worked. Weekends became their own routine. Sometimes he'd drag me out for late-night snacks at the vending machine downstairs. Sometimes we'd sit in silence listening to music. I started to notice how often he stayed up working long after midnight, surrounded by papers and sticky notes that looked like the mind map of a mad scientist. "Don't you ever get tired?" I asked once. "Constantly," he replied without looking up. "I just ignore it until my body quits." "You're going to burn out," he shrugged. "Maybe, but I'd rather burn out doing something interesting." It wasn't arrogance, it was just how his mind worked. Everything about him seemed to orbit curiosity and instinct. He didn't plan, didn't overthink. He simply was. And I realized, to my surprise, that being around him made me want to be the same way. Unafraid, unfiltered, alive. The more time we spent together, the blurrier boundaries became. Our dorm was too small for distance anyway. When both beds were pulled out at night, there was barely 2 feet of carpet between them. I'd wake sometimes to the soft rhythm of his breathing, the faint glow of his laptop still open, playing some nature documentary on mute. There were small moments of contact that didn't mean anything but still stayed with me. Our arms brushing as we reached for the same remote, his hand tapping my shoulder when I dozed off mid-conversation, his casual way of leaning close to show me something on his screen. The first time it happened, I flinched slightly, and he laughed. "You act like I bite," he teased. "Sorry," I said quickly. "Just not used to people being that close." He studied me for a second, then nodded thoughtfully. "We'll fix that." And somehow he did. There were nights we'd talk about life. Deep, unplanned conversations that started over nothing. Once, during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows, we ended up debating whether people were meant to be solitary or social creatures. "I think everyone just wants to be understood," I said. He leaned back on his bed, arms crossed behind his head. "That's the problem. Everyone wants it, but no one knows how to explain themselves. That's depressing." "Realistic," he said with a half-smile. "But maybe some people are just easier to understand than others." I asked what he meant, and he looked at me for a long moment before replying, "Like you. You make sense." My stomach flipped in a way I couldn't explain. I tried to play it off, but the room suddenly felt warmer. By mid-semester, our friendship had become the quiet center of my college life. He wasn't outgoing. He barely interacted with anyone outside class, but people noticed him. Professors liked him. Classmates sought him out for group projects. Yet, somehow, he always returned to our dorm like it was a refuge. "I don't get people," he said one evening, half buried under a pile of notes. "They talk too much and say nothing." I laughed. "You talk plenty." "Only when it matters," he replied. Then, with that same faint smirk, "You listen. That's why I keep talking." It was the closest thing to a compliment I'd ever heard from him. Living in such tight quarters meant learning the rhythm of another person's existence. I knew when he was stressed because he'd start tapping his pencil against his desk. I knew he hated the smell of air fresheners but loved the scent of coffee. He knew I couldn't sleep with the lights on, so he started using a desk lamp at night instead of the overhead bulb. Those small accommodations built an unspoken trust. I didn't realize how much I'd come to rely on his presence until one weekend he went home for a family visit. The first night alone, the silence was unbearable. The room felt wrong. Too neat, too quiet, too empty. I stayed up late scrolling through my phone, but my attention kept drifting to the empty bed across from mine. I missed the faint hum of his computer, the cluttered desk, the background noise of his muttered thoughts. When he returned 2 days later, I caught myself smiling before I could stop it. "Miss me?" he said, teasing but curious. "Not even a little?" I lied, and he grinned, unconvinced. One Friday night, after a long week of classes, we ordered pizza and watched reruns on TV. Halfway through, he dozed off on his bed, one arm draped over his eyes. I turned down the volume and just sat there, watching the flickering light dance across the walls. For reasons I couldn't name, the sight of him like that, unbothered, unguarded, made something inside me go still. It wasn't attraction exactly, not yet. It was more like peace. That realization startled me. For years, I'd felt like I was always performing, pretending to fit into spaces, to laugh at the right moments, to never draw the wrong kind of attention. Around James, the performance faded. I didn't have to pretend. He stirred slightly, mumbling something about missing the end of the show, and I chuckled quietly. "It's fine," I whispered. "You didn't miss much." He didn't answer. The rain outside tapped softly against the window, steady and calm. For the first time since arriving at college, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. By October, the walls of room 912 felt like they had absorbed our routines. The click of James's keyboard, the rustle of pages from my textbooks, the faint hum of his desk fan that never seemed to turn off. We had fallen into a rhythm without ever agreeing to one. He woke before me always. By the time I stumbled out of bed, the coffee maker was already gurgling, and the smell of cheap instant grounds filled the room. He'd be at his desk, hair still messy from sleep, scrolling through lecture notes. I'd mumble "morning," and he'd grunt something that probably meant the same thing. We no longer felt like two strangers sharing space. We were orbiting the same quiet gravity. Our days moved in tandem: classes, meals, study breaks, midnight snacks. He'd wait for me after lectures even if we weren't in the same class, leaning against the wall outside the hall with earbuds in, pretending not to notice when I approached. "Ready?" he'd ask without looking up. Always. That was how it was, wordless comfort wrapped in the chaos of college life. Nights were when things felt different. The rest of the building dimmed to a hush, and we'd stay up talking until 2, sometimes 3 a.m. Started small stories about home, childhood mishaps, favorite shows. But little by little, the walls came down. He talked about how growing up as a first-generation kid made him feel out of place. Too American for his extended family, too foreign for everyone else. "I don't fit anywhere," he said once, staring at the ceiling. "It's like being fluent in 2 languages but not belonging to either of them." The words hung heavy in the dark. I wanted to tell him that he did belong. At least here, in this strange little room with its flickering light and uneven carpet, but I didn't know how to say it without sounding sentimental. Instead, I just said softly, "You're easier to be around than most people." He turned his head toward me, faint amusement curving his mouth. "You say that like it's rare." "It is," I admitted. "At least for me." He didn't reply, but in the silence that followed, I could feel the air change. Like something unspoken had settled between us, invisible but undeniable. Our late-night talks became a kind of ritual. Some nights we shared serious confessions, other times we just rambled about impossible what-ifs. "What would you do?" he asked one night. "If you could start over anywhere in the world?" "Maybe somewhere quiet," I said. "Like a town with no one who knows my name." He smirked. "You don't strike me as the runaway type." "Maybe not, but sometimes I think about disappearing, starting fresh." He thought for a long moment, then said, "You wouldn't have to disappear to do that. You just have to find the right person who makes staying feel new." I didn't know what to say. I just watched the reflection of his monitor light flicker across his face. Calm, unguarded, half a smile hiding under tired eyes. That was the thing about James. He wasn't what people expected. On the surface he was aloof, sarcastic, a little arrogant. But when he let you in, there was this quiet depth, loneliness masked by humor, confidence laced with uncertainty. The more I saw that side of him, the harder it became to categorize what I felt. It wasn't love. At least that's what I told myself. Maybe admiration, maybe fascination. Whatever it was, it made the smallest things feel charged. The sound of his laugh, the way his hand brushed his hair back when he was thinking, the sight of him asleep with one arm hanging off the bed like he'd given up on gravity. Some nights I'd catch myself watching him longer than I should. Just the calm of him existing in the same space, unaware of how much comfort he brought. It wasn't supposed to be like that. One Friday night, our floor organized a movie marathon in the lounge. But James convinced me to skip it. Too many people, he said. Too much popcorn. So we had our own version. We borrowed a couple of DVDs from the common room and huddled around the old TV at the foot of our beds. The first movie was some forgettable action flick. The second was Good Will Hunting. Halfway through, the room had gone dark except for the flicker of the screen. I sat cross-legged on my bed. James had stretched out on his pillow propped behind him. At some point, the volume dipped low enough that the dialogue was barely a whisper. I could hear the soft rhythm of his breathing beside me, the faint squeak of the bed springs when he shifted. "Hey," he said quietly, "you're zoning out." "Sorry, just tired." He smiled, small and knowing. "You're always tired, because you keep me up until 3. Fair." He leaned over the gap between our beds to grab the remote from my nightstand, and for a second, he was close enough that I could feel the warmth of him. The faint scent of detergent and something distinctly him, clean but human. It was nothing, a moment gone as soon as it happened, but my chest tightened anyway. I pretended to adjust the blanket, hoping he wouldn't notice the sudden stiffness in my shoulders. "Good movie," he said. "Makes me want to actually go to therapy." I chuckled nervously. "You? Therapy? I know. Tragic waste of money, right?" He joked. But there was a flicker in his expression. Something serious beneath the humor. When the credits rolled, he didn't move. The light from the TV painted his face in soft blue. "You ever feel like you're not built the way people expect you to be?" he asked. My throat went dry. "All the time." He nodded slowly, eyes still on the screen. "Yeah, same." That was all. No grand confessions, no explanations. Just that quiet, shared truth hanging in the air like static. After that night, I started noticing everything. The way he drummed his fingers when he was deep in thought. The way his laugh came out of nowhere, sudden and bright. Even the things that used to annoy me. His habit of leaving socks everywhere, the cluttered desk, the endless humming, felt endearing now. Scared me. I kept telling myself it was just closeness. People got attached to friends all the time. But friendship didn't usually make your pulse spike when the other person brushed past you in a narrow dorm hallway. I tried to reason it away. "You just admire him," I whispered to myself once while brushing my teeth. "You're just grateful for him." But gratitude didn't explain the way my thoughts drifted toward him when he wasn't around, or the small ache that crept in whenever he left for the weekend. One night, after a long day, he fell asleep on his bed with his textbook open beside him. The lamp cast a soft glow across the room, catching on the lines of his face. I sat at my desk pretending to study but barely read a word. There was something disarming about seeing him like that, peaceful, unguarded. I thought about how, when we first met, I'd been nervous to even share a room. Now, the idea of not sharing it felt impossible. Maybe that was the strangest part. How natural it had become. How easy it was to exist side by side in silence, knowing he was there. The closeness wasn't always physical, but it filled every inch of space between us. One Saturday, while he was out, I stripped the sheets to wash them and noticed the faint imprint of where his elbow always rested on the shared windowsill. It made me laugh, how even the smallest traces of him had found a way to linger. When he returned, the first thing he did was flop onto his bed and groan. "You did laundry," he said accusingly. "You're welcome," I said. "You messed up the system." "What system?" "The precise placement of my chaos." Now I'll never find anything. He gave me a mock glare before breaking into a grin. I threw a pillow at him, and for a split second, everything felt weightless, like the world outside that dorm didn't exist. That night, as we lay in the dark, he said softly, "You know, you're easy to live with. Is that your way of saying thanks?" "It's my way of saying you make things better." I stared at the ceiling, unsure how to respond. My chest felt too tight, my heart too loud. "Same," I managed to whisper. There was a pause, and then the faint rustle of him turning over. "Good," he murmured. "Then we're even." I smiled in the dark, the kind of smile no one sees but still feels. Sleep came slowly that night, filled with restless warmth and quiet confusion. I didn't know what I was to him or what I was becoming. All I knew was that, for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. It was a Thursday night when the storm hit, one of those sudden October tempests that rolled in without warning. The rain started as a whisper, then turned into a hammering roar against the windows. The wind howled through the cracks in the frame, and somewhere down the hall, a door slammed shut hard enough to rattle the picture frame above my desk. James was at his computer, typing something furiously, and I was half asleep over a textbook when the lights flickered once, twice, then everything went black. "Seriously," I muttered, sitting up. James groaned. "Perfect timing." I didn't back that up. The hallway went quiet except for a few distant voices cursing the outage. The hum of his computer died, and the room fell into darkness. Only the sound of the rain filled the air, loud and relentless. James got up and rummaged through his drawers until he found a small camping lantern. He switched it on, and soft amber light spilled across the room, dim but enough to paint shadows across his face. "There," he said, setting it on the floor between our beds. "Primitive but effective." I smiled. "You're always prepared." "For most disasters," he said. "Not for losing a paper halfway done." We sat there for a while, both too wired to sleep and too restless to talk. The storm made the air heavy, like even breathing too loudly might disturb it. Eventually, James broke the silence. "You ever think about how fragile all this is? The power?" I asked. "No. Us." He gestured vaguely around the room. "Everything. People. The stuff we worry about." I glanced over. He wasn't smiling, and his tone was softer than usual. Uncertain, almost hesitant. "What brought that on?" I asked. He leaned back against the wall, the lamplight catching the sharp angle of his jaw. "I don't know. Maybe it's being stuck in the dark with my own thoughts." He gave a short, self-conscious laugh. "I spend so much time pretending I don't care what people think. But when I really think about it, maybe I do. Maybe I care too much." That admission startled me. James wasn't the type to confess weakness. He wore confidence like armor, dry humor, intellect, indifference. To hear him strip that away, even for a second, felt like stumbling onto something private. "I get that," I said quietly. "It's exhausting, trying to look like you've got it all together." He glanced at me then, curious. "You feel that way too?" "Most of the time," I admitted. "I think people see what they want to see. They see a version of you that fits their story, and if you don't match it, they just move on." He nodded slowly. "Yeah. You ever feel like no one really knows you?" "All the time," I said before I could stop myself. "Sometimes I don't even know me." The words came out heavier than I meant them to, landing in the silence between us. I hadn't planned to say that out loud to anyone, least of all him. But in that dim light, with thunder rolling in the distance, honesty felt safer than usual. He didn't reply right away. The storm had quieted to a low rumble, and for a long moment, all I heard was the rhythm of our breathing. Then, quietly, he said, "That's the worst part, isn't it? You can spend years next to people and still feel like a stranger." I looked at him, really looked. His face was half in shadow, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to be a stranger to me," I said before I could think twice. He turned his head, eyes meeting mine. The look wasn't intense or dramatic. It was just steady, searching. "You mean that?" "Yeah." My voice was barely above a whisper. I mean it. He exhaled through his nose, a sound between a sigh and a laugh. You're weirdly easy to talk to. You know that? Maybe I just listen better than most. That's possible. His mouth curved slightly. Still weird, though. We both laughed softly, and the tension eased, but not completely. Something else had taken root underneath the humor. Something fragile and warm. The power outage stretched on. The lantern began to dim, its light fading into a softer gold. James slid off his bed and sat cross-legged on the floor near the light, motioning for me to do the same. Come on, he said. You can't just sit there staring at the ceiling. Tell me something true. I hesitated. Something true. Yeah, no filters. No pretending. I sat down across from him, knees almost touching. The carpet felt rough beneath my hands. Okay, I said after a beat. Something true. I thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. I thought college would feel different, like some big transformation would happen overnight. But it didn't. I still feel like that same uncertain kid trying to prove he belongs somewhere. He nodded thoughtfully. That's not bad. Your turn, I said. He looked down at his hands for a long time. Something true, he repeated quietly. I think I'm afraid of being understood. That surprised me. Why? Because once someone really knows you, he said slowly, they can decide to stop liking you. The honesty in his voice cut through me like static in the quiet. I wanted to say something, anything, to tell him that wasn't true, that he was worth knowing, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I reached out without thinking and touched his shoulder. Just lightly. He froze, glancing at my hand, then back up at me. For a second, I thought I'd overstepped. But then his expression softened, and he let out a small breath. Thanks, he said, his voice low. I pulled my hand back, but the warmth of the moment stayed, humming in the air like a quiet frequency only we could hear. After that, neither of us spoke for a while. We just sat there, the fading lantern between us, shadows stretching long across the floor. I could see the curve of his profile, the way his lashes caught the light, the small furrow between his brows when he was thinking. It should have felt awkward, but it didn't. Felt right, like being exactly where I was supposed to be. At some point, he yawned and lay back on the carpet, hands behind his head. You ever notice how the quiet feels louder when there's no power? Yeah, I murmured. It's like it's waiting for something. He chuckled softly. You're getting poetic on me. Blame the storm. He smiled, eyes half closed. Good excuse. The lantern flickered one last time, and then went out completely, leaving us in the dark again. For a while, I could only hear the rain easing outside, the drip from the gutter, the slow rhythm of his breathing beside me. I shifted slightly, reaching out in the dark to make sure I didn't bump into anything, and my fingers brushed against his arm. It was accidental, just the lightest touch, but it felt like an electric current ran through me. I froze. He didn't move away. In fact, he shifted a little closer, his voice a whisper so soft I almost missed it. Guess we'll have to wait till morning for the lights. Yeah, I said, my throat tight. Morning. We stayed there like that, so close I could feel his warmth, so still it almost felt like we were both afraid to break whatever spell had settled over us. Eventually, he fell asleep on the floor, and I climbed back onto my bed, staring up at the ceiling I couldn't see. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every moment of that night replayed on a loop. The things he said, the way his voice cracked on certain words, the feel of his skin under my fingertips. It wasn't just admiration anymore. It wasn't curiosity. It was something deeper, heavier, and infinitely more complicated. When the power finally clicked back on at dawn, light filling the room again, James was still asleep on the carpet, one arm over his eyes. And I was still awake, lying there in the faint hum of the returning electricity, realizing that somewhere between the silence and the storm, I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I was falling for him, and I didn't know what to do about it. The days that followed the storm felt like a strange calm after a long-held breath. Everything in our room looked the same. The cluttered desks, the two unmade beds, the hum of James's laptop, but something underneath had shifted. We didn't talk about that night. We didn't need to, but silence, once easy, now hummed with a quiet electricity neither of us could ignore. I caught myself watching him more than before, when he leaned over his notes, when he laughed, when he stretched after sitting too long at his desk. And sometimes, when I looked up from my own work, I'd catch him looking too. It wasn't awkward, just unspoken. We both pretended it was normal, but we both knew it wasn't. Weeks slipped by in the gentle blur of mid-semester life. Campus turned colder, the air sharper. Mornings began with the sound of the radiator hissing and ended with both of us buried under blankets, working in the soft lamplight until one of us drifted off mid-sentence. James had grown quieter lately, not distant, just thoughtful. There were moments when I'd see him staring out the window, lost in his head, and I wanted to ask what he was thinking. But then he'd catch me watching and smirk like nothing was wrong, like we were both still pretending not to notice the undercurrent between us. It wasn't heavy or painful. It was something else, something tender. One Friday night near the end of November, he suggested we go for a walk. "It's freezing," I said, pulling on my jacket. "Good," he said. "You'll stay awake long enough to listen." "To what?" He shrugged. "To me being philosophical." We stepped out into the cold. The campus was nearly empty, lamplight stretching long shadows across the path. Our breath came out in clouds, and the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot filled the spaces between words. We walked without a destination, past the library, the football field, the darkened fountain in the courtyard. James stuffed his hands in his pockets. "You ever notice how weirdly quiet it gets at night here?" "Yeah," I said. "It's like the whole world goes on pause." He smiled faintly. "Maybe it's the only time it actually listens." We walked another block in silence before he asked, "You still think about that blackout night?" My pulse jumped. I glanced at him, but his face was unreadable in the dark. "Sometimes," I said carefully. "Do you?" He nodded once. "Sometimes." Neither of us said more for a while. We ended up sitting on a stone bench near the old music hall. The air smelled faintly of wet grass and winter coming. I rubbed my hands together for warmth. "You wanted to be philosophical. Go on." James tossed his jacket onto the chair and flopped onto his bed with a sigh. "You think anyone else is weird enough to go walking at midnight in 40-degree weather?" "Probably," I said. "But no one does it like you." He smiled lazily. "Flattery will get you everywhere." I rolled my eyes, but the warmth in my chest wouldn't fade. He grabbed his laptop and set it between our beds. "Movie?" I nodded. "Sure." We didn't even discuss what to watch. He cued something random, some soft drama neither of us had the energy to follow. The lights were off except for the faint blue glow of the screen. He handed me one earbud, keeping the other. Our shoulders brushed as we sat side by side, backs against our beds, sharing the blanket draped across the edge. It was a simple thing, quiet, ordinary, but the closeness felt like a language of its own. Halfway through the movie, I felt his hand shift slightly, fingers resting near mine. I didn't move. Then, slowly, his pinky brushed against my hand. Just a small, uncertain touch. I looked over at him, but he was watching the screen, face calm, pretending nothing had changed. Could have pulled away. I could have laughed or broken the moment, but I didn't. Instead, I turned my palm slightly, letting my fingers rest against his. The contact was barely there, light enough that someone watching might have missed it. But to me, it felt louder than the film playing in the background, more real than anything I'd felt in a long time. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The movie kept rolling, and somewhere near the middle, he leaned his head lightly against my shoulder. My heart stuttered. Every muscle in me went still, afraid to move, afraid to make it end. He stayed there, quiet, steady, breathing softly in time with mine. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even romantic in the traditional sense. But it was something pure, two people existing in perfect, unspoken understanding. By the time the credits rolled, his hand had found mine fully, fingers threaded together loosely. I could feel his pulse against my skin, calm and even. He looked up at me, eyes half-lidded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're warm," he murmured. "So are you," I whispered back. That earned me a quiet laugh. Good. I was starting to think this place was made of ice. We sat like that for a few minutes longer, the glow of the laptop fading as the screen dimmed. "Hey," he said finally, voice almost too soft to hear. "Thanks for not running away. I wasn't planning to." "Good," he said again. And then, like it was the simplest thing in the world, he leaned his head back against my shoulder and closed his eyes. I watched him for a while, the rise and fall of his chest, the calm in his expression, and felt something inside me settle. There were no labels, no promises, no need to define what this was. It just was. For the first time in months, my thoughts weren't racing. They were quiet, clear, content. The radiator hissed. The wind pressed softly against the window. And in that tiny dorm room, with our hands still resting together and the sound of his breathing steady beside me, I realized that love didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it came like this, soft, wordless, patient. Sometimes it was simply knowing that someone saw you and stayed. By May, the air in the dorms had changed. You could feel the year winding down. The sharp scent of cleaning products, the steady thump of boxes being packed, the laughter that drifted down the hallways for the last time. The walls that had once felt like they were closing in now looked bare and hollow, stripped of posters, photos, and the quiet chaos of everyday life. Our room was no different. James's desk, usually cluttered with notes and energy drink cans, was neat for once. His side of the closet hung half-empty, and his books were stacked neatly in a box labeled summer storage. The space felt wrong that way, too quiet, too still. He was transferring to the upperclassmen dorms next semester, a single room finally. He'd joked about it for weeks. "I'm moving up in the world," he'd said. "No offense, but I think I've earned 4 walls to myself." I'd laughed when he said it, but I hadn't known what to say after. Now, standing there watching him tape the last box shut, all I could think was how strange it was that something so ordinary could feel like an ending. We'd had our ups and downs, of course. There were late nights of laughter and mornings of silence, times when we argued about laundry or whose turn it was to take out the trash. But none of that mattered. Those small irritations had become the background noise of something much larger, a friendship that had become the anchor of my first year away from home. And it wasn't just about him. It was about me, too, who I'd been before I met him, and who I'd become because of him. When I'd arrived that August, I'd been terrified of being seen. I'd been good at staying small, at blending in. But somehow, living next to someone who existed so unapologetically had forced me to stop hiding from myself. James never asked me to change. He never even hinted that he saw through the cracks. He just made space for me, quietly, effortlessly, until I realized I didn't need to pretend anymore. That kind of kindness doesn't announce itself. It just builds, day after day, until you look up one morning and realize it's become part of you. The night before he moved out, we stayed up later than usual. We ordered cheap takeout, watched a movie we didn't really pay attention to, and talked about nothing in particular. The room was lit only by the lamp between our beds, the same one that had flickered through countless late-night conversations. "You excited about having your own place?" I asked. He leaned back against the wall, arms folded behind his head. "Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'll miss not having someone to share pizza with, but maybe I'll finally get some sleep." I smiled. "You'll hate the quiet after a week." He glanced at me, that small, crooked grin I'd come to know so well. "Probably." For a while, we just listened to the hum of the air conditioner. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the dark windows. Then he said, "You know, I never really thanked you for this year." I frowned. "For what?" "You practically kept me alive with caffeine and late-night tutoring." He shook his head. "No, for being around. For sticking with me even when I didn't make it easy." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. "You made it easier than you think." He smiled at that. A small, quiet smile, and the silence that followed felt warm, not heavy. We didn't talk about the things that had gone unspoken all year. We didn't have to. Whatever existed between us wasn't built on declarations. It was built on nights spent talking until dawn, on laughter that filled the smallest spaces, on the quiet certainty that we'd both been changed by the other's presence. The next morning came too quickly. The sun was already bright when he zipped his last bag closed. "Well," he said, looking around the room, "guess that's it." "Guess so," I said, forcing a smile. He looked at me for a moment longer, as if trying to memorize the scene. The half-empty shelves, the faded carpet, the crooked blinds. Then, before I could process it, he stepped forward and pulled me into a brief, firm hug. It wasn't long, but it was enough. "Don't get too boring without me," he said when he let go. "Not a chance," I replied, even though I knew things would be quieter, lonelier. He grinned, slung his backpack over one shoulder, and turned toward the door. "See you around, yeah?" "Yeah," I said. "See you around." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut, and the sound echoed through the empty room like the closing of a chapter. That summer, I went home and found that everything familiar had shifted slightly. My old bedroom felt smaller, the neighborhood quieter. I wasn't sure if the world had changed or if I had. Every so often, I'd think about that dorm room, about the way the morning light spilled through the blinds, about the smell of instant coffee, about the quiet comfort of someone else just being there. James texted sometimes, usually late at night. Short messages. Random thoughts. Saw a guy who looked like you at the bookstore. Scared him by staring too long. Or you'd hate my new roommate. He actually folds his laundry. I'd laugh at my phone screen, smiling in the dark. We saw each other now and then, crossing paths on campus. Sometimes we'd grab lunch, sometimes just wave in passing. It was never awkward. Whatever we'd shared didn't need maintenance. It just existed, steady and unspoken, like something written in invisible ink that only we could read. Years later, I still think about that first year. Not every day, not with longing, more like gratitude. When I look back on who I was before I met him, I see someone unsure, afraid to take up space, terrified of being truly known. When I look back on that year, I see the shift. I learned that connection doesn't always come with labels or promises. Sometimes it's just one person's quiet presence reminding you that you're not invisible. Sometimes it's the laughter that fills a cold room, the conversation that lingers long after the power's gone out, the brush of a hand that tells you everything you're afraid to say out loud. James taught me that love, in whatever form it chooses to arrive, doesn't have to be loud or certain, can be patient, can live in the spaces between words. We never said the words. We didn't have to. That year, he taught me that love doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes, it just moves in next door,